The village of Shadewell was a quiet, close-knit place, nestled in a valley thick with ancient woods. It wasn't large, only a few hundred people, and most had lived there their entire lives, their families tracing back generations. Surrounded by deep forests and fog-laden mountains, Shadewell was the sort of place where people waved to each other in the streets, shared crops from their gardens, and trusted each other implicitly. One crisp autumn morning, an unsettling rumor spread. Eliana Garcia, a young woman in her early 20s, hadn't returned home the previous night. At first, no one was overly worried. Eliana was known to wander the woods just outside the village at sunset, lost in her own thoughts, enjoying the peace. But as the hours dragged on with no sign of her, that casual worry turned to alarm. Her family, the Garcias, were among the most respected in the village. Eliana's mother went door to door, her eyes red and frantic, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Her friends searched the wooded paths, calling her name, but only silence answered back. As the day grew darker, the search for Eliana intensified. People combed the woods in groups, carrying lanterns that glowed like fireflies through the mist. By nightfall, hope had faded, and the search party returned empty-handed. In a somber meeting at the village hall that evening, Paul Lucas, the village head, urged the villagers not to panic. Eliana would be found soon, he assured them, possibly hurt but alive. Yet, his voice lacked conviction. His own worry barely hidden beneath a forced calm. He was aware that Shadewell was an old village, steeped in legends, and the strange forests surrounding them had always harbored a sense of foreboding. The elders spoke in hushed tones about ancient superstitions and howling winds that carried voices at night, but the younger villagers laughed it off, brushing aside the tales. Despite their words, though, the worry lingered. The following morning, the search resumed. Just as the fog began to clear, a shout echoed from the edge of the forest, and everyone ran to the sound. It was Rory Peterson, one of the village's more daring youths, who had stumbled upon a body lying amidst the fallen leaves. They found Eliana's lifeless form sprawled on the forest floor, her face strangely serene, her eyes closed as if merely sleeping. There were no signs of struggle, no blood or injuries, yet her skin was as cold as the autumn air. The villagers stepped back, horrified. It was as if life had simply slipped away from her, leaving no trace of how or why. Paul knelt beside her, his face pale, and gently closed her eyes. He couldn't shake the eerie feeling that clung to him in that moment, as if the forest itself was watching them, knowing something they didn't. The villagers were devastated. Eliana was one of their own, and her sudden death cast a long shadow over Shadewell. Despite their shock, practical concerns took over. How had this happened? What could have caused her death without leaving any mark? The local doctor, Reese McCormick, examined her body but could find nothing conclusive. "It's as though her heart just stopped," he murmured to Paul, a frown deepening on his face. "But she was young, healthy. There's no reason for it." Rumors began to swirl, whispers of darker forces at play. A quiet unease spread among the villagers, with talk of curses and restless spirits. Some said they'd heard strange noises in the woods at night, though they dismissed it as animals or the wind. But the unspoken fear hung heavy. Shadewell was known for its tranquil life, but now that peace had been shattered. The days following Eliana's death were thick with tension. Families began keeping their children indoors, and the forest paths, once teeming with life, lay silent. The people of Shadewell were united by a shared grief but also a shared fear. A fear that they did not dare voice out loud. As the sun set over Shadewell that night, shadows seemed to stretch further, and the village felt more isolated than ever, surrounded by a wall of towering, silent trees. Paul tried to console the villagers, insisting it was a freak occurrence, a tragedy without explanation. But as he lay in bed that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Late that night, Paul woke to the sound of tapping on his window. He peered out into the mist-covered yard, but no one was there. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed something chilling. Etched into the soil just below his window was a symbol, one he couldn't recognize. Shaped like a twisted, looping spiral. It looked old, ancient even. Paul's heart pounded as he stared at it, and a deep sense of dread settled over him, as though he was looking at the start of something far darker than he could imagine. The next day, he would erase the mark and tell no one of it, not wanting to stoke the flames of fear. But he knew, in some hidden corner of his mind, that this was the first sign. And as the village of Shadewell carried on, unaware, a shadow continued to stretch over them, growing longer with each passing day. A few weeks had passed since Eliana Garcia's tragic and mysterious death, yet the quiet dread that had settled over Shadewell lingered. Villagers avoided talking about it openly, but whispers persisted, growing in intensity with each retelling. Parents kept their children close, and people avoided walking near the forest at dusk. Then it happened again. Quinn Brooks, a middle-aged man known for his nightly walks along the village perimeter, disappeared. Quinn was something of a fixture in Shadewell, a friendly soul with a loud laugh and a penchant for storytelling. He wasn't the type to vanish without a word, and his absence sent shockwaves through the community. As news of Quinn's disappearance spread, the villagers organized another search party. They combed through the forest with grim determination, lanterns cutting through the misty twilight as they called out his name. The sense of déjà vu was unnerving, bringing back memories of Eliana's disappearance. And people couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than mere coincidence. After hours of searching, they found Quinn. His body lay crumpled by the bank of a shallow creek just beyond the village boundary. Like Eliana, he showed no signs of struggle, injury, or harm. His expression was eerily calm, his skin cold and pale in the morning light. The only hint of something sinister was a faint mark, barely visible, on the back of his hand, a tiny spiral similar to the one Paul had seen outside his window. The village doctor was again called to examine the body. As he knelt by Quinn, his face turned ashen. "I can't explain it," he whispered to Paul, who stood nearby, shoulders slumped in disbelief. "It's as if life just left him, like something took it away." With 2 unexplained deaths in such a short time, Shadewell was on edge. In the village hall that evening, Paul addressed a crowd of anxious villagers. His voice was steady, but a shadow of fear flickered in his eyes. "Whatever's happening, we'll find an answer," he promised. "But we need to stay calm. If anyone has seen anything unusual, I urge you to come forward." The crowd remained silent. The people of Shadewell, though bound by years of friendship and community, exchanged suspicious glances as if searching for someone to blame. No one knew who or what to trust anymore. Finally, Fiona McCormick, the doctor's wife and the village's unofficial historian, spoke up. "What if it's something from the past?" Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Shadewell has been here for centuries. This land is old. Maybe it holds something darker than we remember." Her words stirred the crowd, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Shadewell had always been known for its old legends, tales of restless spirits and curses. Most people had brushed them off as superstition. Yet, as one villager after another went missing, those old stories felt more real than ever. In a bid to calm the villagers, Paul implemented a curfew and organized nightly patrols. Volunteers, armed with lanterns and simple weapons, patrolled the village outskirts. Paul joined the patrols himself, hoping his presence would reassure people. But as the nights dragged on, with the forest looming dark and silent around them, Paul's faith in their ability to protect themselves began to waver. The villagers' fears intensified when Raymond Lucas, one of Paul's younger cousins, reported seeing strange figures moving between the trees during his patrol. He couldn't make out faces or details, but he was certain that he'd seen more than just shadows. "It felt wrong," Raymond confided in Paul afterward, his face pale. "I've hunted in those woods my whole life, but I've never felt anything like that. Whatever's out there, it isn't just wildlife." One evening, Diana Reynolds, a quiet woman who lived on the edge of Shadewell, found something disturbing on the trees near her home. Carved into the bark were spirals, just like the one Paul had seen beneath his window, now scattered on trees throughout the forest's edge. Each mark was a dark stain against the pale wood, as though the carvings had been there for centuries, only now appearing. When Paul saw the symbols for himself, a chill ran through him. He recalled the night he'd found that spiral in the dirt, how he'd erased it and tried to forget. But it was as if the forest was sending a message, a warning that no one could ignore any longer. The villagers gathered to inspect the marks, many crossing themselves or whispering old prayers for protection. Fiona approached one of the symbols, running her fingers over the groove, a strange expression on her face. "These markings, they're old, like the ones I've seen in the oldest parts of Shadewell's cemetery," she murmured. "They're symbols of protection or of warning." That night, the village council convened a meeting, packed with anxious villagers. The mood was tense, and fear hung heavy in the air as Paul addressed the crowd. "We don't know what these symbols mean," he said, "but we can't ignore them. There's something in Shadewell's history that we may have overlooked, something buried too deep for any of us to remember." The villagers listened in silence, their faces pale and drawn. Many looked to Fiona, who had spent years studying Shadewell's legends, hoping for answers. She stood up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shadewell has always been a strange place. It's not just stories. Our ancestors believed this land was guarded by spirits, that certain areas held power. They warned never to disturb the forest, never to dig too deep." Her words cast a pall over the room, and for the first time, the villagers realized just how much they had taken their quiet lives for granted. Shadewell was not a place where mysteries were welcome. It was a place of tradition, where life had gone on unchanged for generations. And yet now it was as if the land itself was stirring, reclaiming something that had been forgotten. Late that night, Paul sat in his small office, his mind racing. Just as he was about to call it a night, a knock sounded at his door. Standing in the doorway was Raymond, his cousin, holding a small, weathered object in his hands, a fragment of carved stone, etched with the same spiral symbol found on the trees. He had discovered it buried just beneath the forest soil near Quinn's body. "I don't know what it means," Raymond said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I think it's been here a long time, hidden, waiting for someone to find it." Paul took the stone, feeling its rough, cold surface. His chest tightened with a sense of foreboding, as though this small object was somehow connected to the deaths, part of a puzzle that he couldn't yet understand. He knew one thing: whatever force was haunting Shadewell, it wasn't finished. And as he turned the stone over in his hands, he feared that the village's quiet days were over. Shadewell was no longer the familiar, tranquil village it had once been. The villagers carried on with their daily routines, but an ever-present unease weighed on them. The forests surrounding the village, once a peaceful backdrop, had become a place of silent dread, its shadows feeling longer and darker. The people avoided even glancing at it, fearing what might be watching from the depths. Determined to protect his people, Paul Lucas, the village head, had increased patrols, setting curfews and urging villagers to stay indoors after sunset. Yet, despite all his efforts, the fear among the villagers grew. They had heard the stories, whispered from house to house. Something was moving in the shadows, something they couldn't see, but could feel. Then came the rumors of figures in the woods. One evening, Diana Reynolds, who lived closest to the forest's edge, claimed to have seen a figure standing motionless in the trees just beyond her property. She described it as tall, cloaked in shadow, and entirely still, as if it were watching her. When she called out, the figure didn't move. It simply vanished, melting into the darkness. Diana's story swept through Shadewell like wildfire, heightening the village's collective fear. People began to avoid even looking in the direction of the forest at night. Some claimed to hear strange whispers or see brief flashes of movement between the trees, and each new tale fed the growing paranoia. Rhys McCormick, the village doctor, spoke privately with Paul the next morning. "The fear is spreading," he warned, worry creasing his brow. "People are seeing things in every shadow. If we don't put a stop to this, panic will tear Shadewell apart." Paul agreed, but in his heart, he sensed Rhys was overlooking something crucial. The villagers' fear wasn't unfounded. It was as though Shadewell itself had changed, and whatever lay dormant in its shadows had finally awakened. The sightings didn't stop. Over the next few days, more villagers reported seeing shadowy figures drifting between the trees at dusk. The figures always vanished as soon as anyone tried to approach. Some children swore they heard faint, melodic sounds coming from the forest at night, eerie songs in a language they didn't understand. These strange occurrences began to chip away at the villagers' sense of safety. People who once left their doors unlocked now bolted them tightly every night. Families slept huddled together, and lanterns burned in windows long after dark. The atmosphere was one of isolation and growing terror, as if Shadewell itself was being slowly drained of its warmth and familiarity. In the midst of this fear, a stranger arrived in Shadewell. Ron Perez, a tall, dark-haired man with an intense gaze, appeared one evening just as the sun was setting. He stayed at the local inn, barely speaking to anyone but observing everything around him with a sharp, almost unsettling gaze. His mere presence unsettled the villagers, his silence lending him an air of mystery and foreboding. Paul, wary of anyone who might bring more unrest to Shadewell, approached Ronan the following morning. "Are you just passing through?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral but his expression guarded. Ronan paused before answering, his voice low and deliberate. "I came because I heard about the disappearances," he said. "There's talk of strange deaths, stories that reach even the villages miles away. I've seen it before." A chill settled over Paul. "Seen what before?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Places where the land remembers," Ronan replied, his gaze unflinching. "Places where old forces stir, where people vanish and life drains from a village." Paul tried to shake off the ominous feeling Ronan's words left him with, yet he couldn't deny the knot of dread tightening in his chest. He agreed to meet with Ronan that evening to discuss what he'd seen in other villages, hoping the stranger might hold some clue to end the nightmare in Shadewell. That evening, Paul invited Fiona McCormick, the village's historian, to join him and Ronan in the village hall. Fiona's deep knowledge of Shadewell's history and folklore made her an invaluable ally, and Paul trusted her insight. Ronan leaned forward, his face half-shadowed in the candlelight, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are places like this," he began, his words drawing Fiona and Paul into his dark narrative. "Places where people start to vanish, where bodies are found with no visible cause of death. These places share something in common, a history hidden beneath the soil, long forgotten by those who live on it." Fiona listened intently, her face growing pale. "Shadewell has a long history," she murmured, almost to herself. "Generations have lived here, but there are legends, stories of an old settlement that vanished centuries ago. They say it was built on sacred ground, a place where no one was supposed to live." Ronan nodded, his expression grim. "In other villages I've seen, they found similar stories, a site of a forgotten burial ground, marked by ancient symbols. Symbols like the spirals you've been finding here." Paul's hand instinctively went to his pocket, where he kept the small stone fragment with the spiral mark that Raymond had found. "This," he said, showing it to Ronan, who took it and examined it closely. "These symbols mark something sacred," Ronan said, his voice dark with warning. "Something that was never meant to be disturbed." Ronan explained that the spiral symbols were often linked to ancient cults, groups who believed in protecting their land through ritual sacrifices and pacts. According to Ronan, those who ignored these symbols risked awakening the land's protective spirits. Spirits who would reclaim the lives of anyone who dared to settle there. Fiona's face grew pale as she processed his words. If these symbols were warnings, then the deaths. She trailed off, glancing at Paul, horror dawning in her eyes. Paul's mind raced as he tried to piece together the implications. "Are you saying that Shadewell is cursed?" he asked, feeling the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. Ronan looked him straight in the eyes. "Not cursed, exactly. But the land here remembers. It demands respect. Those who disturb it, well, they pay the price." The silence in the room was suffocating, each of them grappling with the unsettling truth. Shadewell, it seemed, was built on ground that had once been sacred, and by living there, they had unknowingly awakened something dark and ancient. The next day, rumors of the meeting between Paul, Fiona, and Ronan spread throughout Shadewell. People whispered of ancient curses, of vengeful spirits awakened by the villagers' presence. Doors stayed shut, and the streets were empty by dusk. Some even began packing their belongings, quietly planning to leave Shadewell in hopes of escaping whatever darkness had taken root in their village. Paul, sensing the village's unraveling, called a council meeting that evening. Standing before the anxious crowd, he tried to reassure them, though his own fear was barely hidden. "We'll find answers," he said, forcing a confidence he didn't feel. "Whatever is haunting Shadewell, we will face it together." But the villagers' fear ran deep, and their faith in his leadership had begun to waver. Each shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper, and an unspoken dread filled the air. Shadewell was slipping away, its people held captive by a fear they couldn't see but could feel with every fiber of their being. That night, as Paul prepared for bed, he glanced out his window and froze. There, carved into the wood of his door, was the spiral symbol, freshly etched and dark against the pale wood. His heart pounded as he opened the door and stepped outside, his lantern casting a dim glow over the yard. In the mist, he thought he saw movement, a figure, tall and dark, slipping away into the trees, leaving only the echo of a haunting melody that lingered in the air. Paul watched, his hands shaking, as the shadow disappeared, leaving him with the sinking feeling that Shadewell was no longer his to protect. It was as if the village itself was being claimed by something ancient, something relentless, and it had only just begun. Despite Paul Lucas's attempts to maintain order, he could feel the villagers slipping away from his control, their faith in him eroding with each new disappearance. The symbols on the trees, the sightings of figures in the forest, and the haunting stories whispered from one family to another all contributed to a village on the edge of hysteria. Then, the unthinkable happened. It was late in the afternoon when Paul received the news that his daughter, Daphne Lucas, was missing. She had gone to deliver fresh bread to an elderly neighbor, but hours had passed and she hadn't returned. Panic surged through Paul as he organized a search party, his heart pounding with dread. The search party combed the forest and surrounding fields, calling her name and hoping, praying for a response. The sun began to set, and Paul's desperation grew. Memories of the other disappearances flooded his mind, each face a reminder of what could happen to Daphne. The hours stretched into an agonizing night, and just as the first light of dawn appeared, a call rang out from the forest's edge. They had found her. Daphne's body lay on the forest floor, her face serene, her hands folded across her chest as if placed there deliberately. There were no marks of struggle, no sign of injury. She looked almost peaceful. Yet her skin was pale and cold. Paul fell to his knees beside her, grief overwhelming him. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. The villagers watched from a distance, their shock and sorrow etched on their faces. If the forest could claim the village head's daughter, then no one was safe. Daphne's death sent a ripple of fear through Shadewell like nothing before. The loss of the village head's own daughter marked a point of no return for the villagers. The curfews, the patrols, the attempts to restore order, all seemed futile now. If Paul couldn't protect his own family, what hope was there for the rest of them? More families began packing their belongings, their homes growing emptier each day as they prepared to leave Shadewell for good. It was no longer just fear that gripped the village. It was the realization that they were dealing with a force far beyond their control. Paul, reeling from his grief and feeling the village slip further into chaos, turned to Fiona McCormick and Ronan Perez for guidance. They gathered late that night in Paul's home, his grief visible but tempered by a new determination to find answers. "This isn't just superstition," Paul said, his voice hollow. "Something is here in Shadewell, something real. We need to understand what it wants, or there will be no one left." Ronan nodded solemnly. "This is no ordinary haunting or curse. I've seen this pattern before, a dark force claiming lives in small, isolated places. But it never stops unless the land is appeased or cleansed." "What can we do?" Fiona asked, her voice trembling. "How do we appease something we don't understand?" "There may be a way," Ronan replied, his eyes dark with memory. "In other villages, rituals were performed to communicate with the land's spirits, but they were dangerous and many didn't survive. We'll need everyone to help if we're going to attempt it." The following day, Paul called a village meeting in the square. Those who hadn't yet fled gathered reluctantly, a mix of fear and hope on their faces. Paul stood before them, his voice filled with the weight of loss but resolute. "We cannot let Shadewell fall apart," he said. "We've lost friends, family, our own children, and we may never understand why. But there may be a way to stop it." He explained the plan, a ritual to communicate with whatever force was haunting Shadewell. The villagers listened, some horrified, others doubtful, but a few saw the desperation in Paul's eyes and knew he would do anything to end this nightmare. They nodded, slowly coming to terms with the fact that they had little choice. Fiona, familiar with the ancient folklore of Shadewell, explained the details of the ritual, outlining what each villager would need to contribute. This ritual isn't just about words or symbols, she warned. It requires intent, a true offering of ourselves to the land. If we go through with this, we may open a door that can't be closed. Despite her warning, the villagers agreed. They were desperate, willing to risk anything if it meant putting an end to the deaths. The village prepared for the ritual, each person playing their part. They gathered herbs, created small offerings of personal items, and drew symbols matching those found in the forest on a large stone circle in the clearing. The air felt charged, as if something dark and ancient was watching them, waiting. Rhys McCormick, though skeptical, couldn't deny the weight of the atmosphere as night fell and the villagers gathered at the ritual site. Shadewell was usually peaceful at night, but this evening, an unnatural silence blanketed the village, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind. As they lit torches and candles, forming a circle around the stone markings, Paul took his place at the center, flanked by Fiona and Ronan. He looked out at the faces of the villagers, each one mirroring his own desperation and fear. Ronan stepped forward, his voice low and steady as he began to chant in a language foreign to the villagers. Fiona translated portions for them, guiding them through the ritual's steps. Each villager offered their item to the circle, throwing it into a small fire in the center. With each offering, the air grew heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in on them, watching with cold, ancient eyes. Then came the final step. Ronan held up the stone fragment with the spiral symbol, its rough surface glinting in the firelight. "This stone is the key," he said, his voice resonating in the still night. "It holds the memory of Shadewell's ancient past. With it, we'll attempt to contact the spirits who once protected this land." As he placed the stone in the center of the circle, a chill swept through the clearing, and the villagers felt a presence pressing down on them. Whispers echoed through the trees, faint but unmistakable, as if voices from another time were trying to break through. Suddenly, the fire in the center of the circle flared, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The villagers gasped as they saw a vision unfold within the flames. Ghostly images of the missing villagers, their faces twisted in expressions of terror, reaching out as if calling for help. The vision was brief but powerful, and the villagers looked on in horror, unable to tear their eyes away. As the flames died down, an unnatural stillness settled over the group. A figure seemed to materialize within the circle, a faint, ethereal shape that loomed, barely visible but undeniably there. The villagers felt its gaze, heavy and all-encompassing, a force beyond their understanding. Paul, trembling, stepped forward. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice hoarse with fear. "Why are you taking our people?" The figure didn't respond, but in the silence, a single word seemed to echo through their minds. Appease. It was as if the land itself had spoken, demanding something the villagers couldn't comprehend. The ritual ended in silence, the villagers staring at the remnants of the fire, unable to process what they had just experienced. The presence had vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and the unsettling word ringing in their minds. Paul looked at Ronan and Fiona, his face pale. "This isn't over," he whispered. "The land wants something, but we don't know what. And until we find out, it will keep taking." As they walked back to their homes that night, each villager felt the weight of the unknown pressing on them, realizing that the ritual had only given them a glimpse into the darkness that had taken root in Shadewell. Whatever haunted their village was far from satisfied, and as they slept, shadows gathered just beyond the village limits, waiting patiently for their next move. The ritual had left a deep scar on Shadewell. Though the villagers had hoped for peace, they were instead met with an overwhelming sense of dread. The word appease echoed in their minds, haunting them even in their dreams. Paul Lucas could hardly sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter Daphne's face, her lifeless form lying cold in the forest. He hadn't even begun to process his grief when he was confronted with yet another horror. It was a misty morning when Elsie Lucas, Paul's remaining child, disappeared. She had been with him the night before, sharing a quiet meal, the two of them finding brief comfort in each other's company. But when Paul woke up, Her bed was empty, the sheets cold. A wave of terror swept over him. It felt as though the darkness was hunting his family, taking piece by piece of his heart. News of Elsie's disappearance spread quickly through Shadewell, striking the villagers with a fresh wave of horror. If the land's curse was targeting even the village head's family, then no one was safe. Paul could barely contain his anguish, his heartache raw and visible as he pleaded with the villagers to join him in another search. Once more, they entered the forest, their lanterns casting faint circles of light in the mist. Paul led the group, driven by desperation, his face pale and drawn. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig heightened their anxiety, each step deeper into the forest, bringing them closer to the inevitable. Hours later, they found Elsie. She lay beneath an ancient oak, her face calm like Daphne's, her hands folded across her chest. There was no sign of struggle, and once again, no mark of injury. The only clue was a faint spiral, barely visible on her wrist, the same symbol they had seen on the trees and on her sister's body. Paul knelt beside her, his anguish overwhelming. His body shook with silent sobs as he clutched her hand, unable to accept the reality of losing both his daughters. The villagers stood back, watching with a mix of grief and terror, realizing that something far beyond their understanding was tearing their village apart. Elsie's death shattered any remaining hope the villagers had held on to. They began to turn on one another, suspicion and paranoia spreading like wildfire. Some villagers accused Paul of angering the spirits, others blamed Ronan for stirring up dark forces, while others still claimed Fiona's knowledge of the village's ancient past was a curse in itself. Shadewell, once united, was now divided by mistrust and fear. Families began leaving in greater numbers, their homes abandoned and left to decay. The streets that had once been filled with laughter and conversation were now eerily silent, the village emptying one household at a time. Paul, broken by the loss of his daughters, isolated himself, refusing to speak to anyone but Ronan and Fiona. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. He had once sworn to protect his people, yet here he was, powerless to stop the darkness that had taken his children and torn his village apart. Desperate for answers, Paul turned to Ronan and Fiona once more, hoping they might find something, anything, that could explain the curse and the meaning of the spirals. They spent hours in the village archives, poring over old documents, searching for any record of the rituals and symbols they had encountered. Finally, Fiona found a journal, faded and worn with age, written by one of Shadewell's earliest settlers. The entries spoke of a settlement that had existed centuries before Shadewell, built on sacred ground marked with spirals. The people of this settlement had worshipped forest spirits, leaving offerings and sacrifices in exchange for protection. But something had gone wrong. The journal entries grew darker, filled with tales of disappearances and deaths. The last entry was a warning scrawled hastily across the page. "The land remembers. It will reclaim what is owed." Fiona's hands shook as she closed the journal, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She shared her findings with Paul and Ronan, and together, they pieced together a chilling truth. Shadewell was built on cursed ground. The land had been awakened, and it demanded sacrifice. Ronan, visibly shaken by the journal, finally revealed a truth he had hidden. His family had been wanderers for generations, passing down stories of cursed lands and haunted villages. His ancestors had once settled near a plague Shadewell, but they had fled when the land began claiming lives. Ronan had come to Shadewell not just out of curiosity, but because he suspected it was one of those cursed places he had heard of. "My family always believed in the power of the land," he explained. "They believed that certain places hold ancient forces that can't be tamed. We called them the Forsaken Grounds." He looked at Paul, his eyes dark and serious. "Shadewell is one of them. The land here, it wants something, and it won't stop until it gets it." Paul felt a chill settle over him as Ronan's words sank in. He realized that Shadewell wasn't just facing an ordinary curse. They were dealing with something older, something far beyond their understanding. Knowing the land's curse had already claimed so many lives, Paul, Ronan, and Fiona faced a difficult decision. They gathered the remaining villagers, the few who hadn't already left, and shared what they had learned. Paul's voice was steady, but his eyes held a haunted look as he spoke. "We know now that Shadewell was built on forsaken ground," he said, his voice echoing in the silence. "We may not understand it fully, but we know that this land is demanding something from us. If we want to end this, we may have to make a sacrifice." The villagers were horrified. They had already lost so much: loved ones, friends, neighbors. But as they looked at Paul, they saw his grief, his desperation, and they knew that he had already lost more than anyone. Slowly, reluctantly, they agreed. They would try one last ritual, a final offering to appease the land. The remaining villagers gathered what they could for the ritual. Each family contributed something personal: a ring, a trinket, a piece of cloth from someone they had lost. Fiona and Ronan helped prepare the ritual site, drawing spirals in the dirt, marking a place for each villager to stand. As the sun set over Shadewell, casting long shadows over the empty streets and abandoned homes, the villagers gathered at the ritual site, their faces pale but determined. They knew this might be their last chance to save what was left of their home, and each one carried a silent hope that they would be able to end the nightmare that had taken over their lives. Paul stood at the center of the circle, holding Daphne and Elsie's favorite possessions, a small toy and a book they had shared. His heart ached, but he knew he had to be strong, for them and for the villagers who remained. He began to speak, his voice low but firm. "We have lost so much to this curse," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But we are here together, bound by our love for this village. Whatever this land demands, we will give, and may it finally be satisfied." The villagers followed his lead, each placing their offering in the center of the circle. Ronan began chanting, his voice a deep, steady rhythm that echoed through the silent night. Fiona guided the villagers through the ritual, each person contributing their energy, their intent, their sorrow. As the ritual continued, the air grew colder, and a faint mist began to creep in from the forest, swirling around the villagers. They felt a presence, heavy and dark, pressing down on them. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting. A figure appeared within the mist, barely visible but unmistakable. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The villagers gasped, some stepping back in fear, but Paul held his ground, staring directly at the apparition. "What do you want from us?" he called out, his voice shaking but defiant. The figure did not respond, but in the silence, a word seemed to echo through their minds: sacrifice. It was a demand, a final, unyielding command from the ancient forces that ruled the land. Paul realized what the land wanted. It wasn't just any sacrifice, it wanted him, the head of the village, the man who had tried to defy its power. He looked at Fiona and Ronan, understanding dawning in his eyes. "If my life can save Shadewell," he said softly, "then I will give it." The villagers cried out in protest, but Paul raised his hand, silencing them. He stepped into the center of the circle, his heart heavy but resolute. And as he closed his eyes, he felt the land's presence envelop him, pulling him into its ancient embrace. The mist thickened, swirling around him, and then he was gone. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their grief overwhelming, but as the mist began to clear, a strange calm settled over them. They sensed, in some unexplainable way, that the land was finally at peace. Though Paul's sacrifice had quieted the village, it didn't explain everything. The symbols, the figures in the forest, the ancient curse on Shadewell. With the village's leadership now empty, Fiona McCormick took it upon herself to continue the search for answers. Joined by Ronan Perez, whose knowledge of the supernatural had become invaluable, they prepared to venture deeper into Shadewell's hidden history. Determined to find the roots of the curse, Fiona and Ronan searched through the remaining historical documents in Shadewell's small archives. Among the old papers and yellowed maps, Fiona found a journal that had been forgotten in a dusty corner. It was bound in cracked leather, its pages faded with age, but still legible. The journal belonged to Agnes Reynolds, one of Shadewell's earliest settlers. Fiona's hands trembled as she read the entries, each one shedding light on the village's troubled past. Agnes described a time when the original settlers encountered an ancient forest-dwelling cult, a group that worshipped the land itself and believed in a balance between life and death. They marked their territory with spirals, symbols meant to bind the land's power and prevent it from falling into darkness. But as more settlers arrived, they cleared the forest, disturbing the burial grounds of the cult members and erasing the sacred symbols. Agnes wrote of strange occurrences following this, of disappearances and strange sicknesses. Her final entry was chilling. The land speaks, and it demands. It will not be silenced. The journal provided them with a clue. The site of the old burial grounds, located in a dense part of the forest where the cult's ancient symbols still mark the trees. According to Agnes's journal, the cult believed that their dead would watch over the forest, protecting it from those who would harm it. The forest spirits, they claimed, would only rest when the land was treated with reverence. Fiona and Ronan prepared to enter the forest, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity. They were joined by a few villagers brave enough to continue the search for answers. Though they had lost much, a sense of duty compelled them to understand the force that had haunted Shadewell. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew thick with an eerie silence. The trees seemed to close in around them, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. They followed the spirals carved into the bark, each symbol drawing them closer to the heart of the forest. Eventually, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a large flat stone, covered in ancient carvings and surrounded by a ring of twisted branches. Fiona recognized the spirals from the symbols they had seen on the bodies and around the village. This, she realized, was the heart of the curse, a place where the forest's power had been bound long ago. Ronan knelt beside the stone, his fingers tracing the spirals with reverence. "This is it," he whispered. "The burial grounds where the cult members believed their spirits would remain to protect the land." Ronan's voice was filled with awe as he explained what he knew of such places. In some ancient beliefs, burial grounds were not just graves, they were places of power, places where the living and the dead coexisted in a sacred balance. By disturbing this balance, we may have released something that shouldn't have been awakened. Fiona nodded, her mind racing with questions. But why Paul? Why the others? Why did the land demand lives? "The land remembers those who disturb it," Ronan replied, his voice grave. "The settlers erased these symbols, these markers. In doing so, they broke the pact made by those who came before. The spirits were bound to protect the land, but without the symbols to appease them, they turned to reclaim what was taken." As Fiona and Ronan pieced together the story, they began to understand the curse's origins. The early settlers of Shadewell had unknowingly desecrated a place held sacred by the forest cult. In removing the spirals, they had broken an ancient pact, a pact that, without its binding symbols, had unleashed the land's anger upon them. As the villagers gathered around, a chilling thought crossed Fiona's mind. "If these spirits were meant to protect the land," she whispered, "then perhaps they're not satisfied. Paul's sacrifice was enough to quiet them, but it won't last forever." Ronan looked at her, the realization dawning in his own eyes. The land isn't asking for one sacrifice, it's asking for remembrance. It wants the symbols restored for the pact to be renewed, or else it will continue to claim lives. The villagers listened in stunned silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. They understood that Shadewell's curse was not something that could be banished with a single ritual or sacrifice. It was a living force, a bond that needed to be restored with reverence and care. The villagers debated, uncertain and fearful, but eventually agreed that restoring the pact was their only hope. They would recarve the spirals, marking the boundaries of the ancient burial grounds and honoring the spirits that had once protected them. Ronan guided them through the steps, explaining that each spiral had to be carved with intention, a symbol of their renewed respect for the land. They spent hours working in silence, each villager carving a spiral into the trees surrounding the burial grounds. It was an act of both desperation and reverence, a plea for peace from forces they could barely comprehend. As the last spiral was carved, Fiona led a final prayer, offering their collective sorrow and regret to the forest. She spoke of those they had lost, of Paul, of the villagers who had left in fear, and of the lives they hoped to protect. Her words echoed through the forest, a humble apology to the spirits who had been wronged. When the ritual ended, a strange calm settled over the burial grounds. The villagers felt a weight lift from their hearts, and the oppressive air that had haunted Shadewell seemed to dissipate. They could almost sense a presence around them, silent but peaceful, as though the forest had finally accepted their offering. As they left the burial grounds and made their way back to the village, a soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of renewal. Fiona and Ronan exchanged a glance, understanding that they had not just restored the pact, but had finally given Shadewell a chance at peace. The villagers returned to Shadewell with a newfound respect for the land they called home. They knew that the forest, while now quiet, would never be completely safe. The pact they had restored was fragile, something that would need to be honored and remembered by each generation to come. Fiona gathered the remaining villagers that night, urging them to pass down the story of Shadewell's curse to their children. "This land is old, and it remembers," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "We must honor the pact we have renewed today, or risk unleashing this darkness upon ourselves once again." As she spoke, the villagers nodded solemnly, each one understanding the weight of their responsibility. They had uncovered a hidden history, one woven into the very soil of Shadewell, and they knew that they could never allow it to be forgotten. As they drifted back to their homes, the village felt different, quieter perhaps, but also more sacred, each step echoing with the memory of those they had lost. And though they would rebuild, they would forever live with the reminder that Shadewell was not just a place to live, it was a place to remember. For the first time, Shadewell felt at peace. But in the shadows of the forest, the spirals gleamed faintly, a silent, eternal reminder of the pact between the living and the land. As the weeks passed, Shadewell began to regain a semblance of normalcy. The villagers, though cautious, resumed their routines, the memory of the curse still fresh in their minds. They had carved the spirals and restored the ancient pact, believing that they had finally appeased the forest spirits. Yet beneath the surface, a lingering unease remained, an awareness that Shadewell was not entirely free from its dark past. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the village prepared for dusk, an unfamiliar figure appeared on the horizon. A rugged man in his mid-40s with piercing eyes and a quiet intensity approached Shadewell on foot. He carried little with him, just a small satchel and an air of weariness. But something about his presence was unsettling. Word of his arrival spread quickly through the village. After everything they had endured, the villagers were wary of strangers, especially one who seemed so out of place in Shadewell. Rumors circulated that he might be connected to the curse, or that he had come to bring news of other villages facing similar horrors. Raphael was greeted by Fiona McCormick, who had taken on the role of unofficial caretaker of Shadewell's legacy since Paul's passing. She approached him with cautious curiosity, offering a polite but guarded welcome. Raphael met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I've heard stories of Shadewell," he said simply. "Stories of disappearances, of a land that demands something in return. I came to see if it was true." His words sent a chill through Fiona. Few outside Shadewell knew of the curse, and those who did had already left the village, hoping to leave its darkness behind. "What brought you here?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. Raphael hesitated before answering. "I've traveled to places like Shadewell before," he replied, his voice soft but unyielding. "Places with unresolved histories. I've come to help if I can." Fiona studied him, sensing a depth to his words that he wasn't revealing. Though his intentions were unclear, she felt drawn to his knowledge, a potential ally in understanding the forces they had yet to fully comprehend. That evening, Fiona invited Raphael to stay at her home. They sat by the fire, and as the flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, she asked him to explain his experiences with cursed lands. Raphael leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering light, and shared stories of villages lost to ancient pacts, towns that had vanished into nothingness, and people claimed by the earth itself. "Many believe curses are bound to words or objects," he began, his tone dark. "But true curses, like what you face here in Shadewell, are alive. They live in the soil, in the trees, in the air itself. And once awakened, they rarely go back to sleep." Fiona listened, captivated and horrified. She had hoped that restoring the spirals had ended Shadewell's curse, but Raphael's stories suggested that the darkness might still linger, waiting for a moment of weakness. "You think the curse here is still active?" she asked, a sense of dread creeping into her voice. Raphael nodded. "What you've done is enough to quiet it, perhaps for a time, but curses like this, They leave shadows. They watch and wait, feeding on fear. As they spoke, Raphael shared a chilling insight. In villages like this, the curse often has a center, a place where its power is strongest. If you want to understand it fully, you have to find that center. Only then will you know if you've truly freed Shadewell. Fiona's mind raced as she recalled the clearing in the forest where they had found the burial grounds. Was that the center he spoke of? Or was there something even deeper within the land's history? Something they had missed? Raphael's words planted a seed of doubt in her mind, and she realized they might not have reached the heart of the curse. He looked at her, his expression grave. Be careful, Fiona. Some things should remain buried. But if you're willing to search for answers, know that the curse may reveal more than you're prepared to see. The next day, Fiona introduced Raphael to Ronan Perez, hoping the two might share insights and potentially deepen their understanding of the curse. However, Ronan was immediately wary of Raphael, sensing a guardedness in the stranger that unsettled him. Ronan voiced his concerns privately to Fiona. We don't know him, Fiona. We don't know why he's here or what he really wants. He claims to have knowledge of curses, but for all we know, he could be drawing us back into the darkness we just escaped. Fiona, though wary herself, felt that Raphael's arrival might be a chance to understand the curse on a deeper level. We can't ignore him, Ronan, she replied. He knows things about places like Shadewell that we don't. Maybe he's here for a reason. Ronan reluctantly agreed to listen, but he remained skeptical. In his mind, Raphael's arrival was either a sign of new hope or an omen of greater darkness. Raphael suggested they revisit the forest, specifically the burial grounds, to look for signs that might indicate a center of the curse. With a small group of remaining villagers, they entered the woods, following the familiar spirals carved into the trees. As they reached the clearing, Raphael examined the stones and markings with a critical eye. He moved methodically, as if searching for something specific. Then, as he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped, his eyes fixed on a patch of ground that seemed slightly disturbed. Without hesitation, he knelt down and began clearing the dirt, revealing another symbol beneath the surface. Unlike the spirals, this mark was jagged, an angular shape that felt harsh and unnatural. This, Raphael said, his voice filled with dread. This is a binding mark. Whoever placed it here wanted to keep something trapped. Raphael's discovery sent a shockwave through the group. The mark, though faint, hinted at an older, deeper force tied to the land, something not bound by the pact they had restored. The realization struck them with an ominous certainty. Shadewell's curse was layered, a mystery that had been hidden beneath centuries of fear and superstition. Someone knew of this curse, Raphael murmured, tracing the jagged mark with his finger. They tried to contain it, but binding a curse only delays it. Eventually it will find a way to break free. Fiona's face paled. If this mark is broken, what happens to Shadewell? Raphael met her gaze, his expression grim. The curse won't just reclaim what was taken, it will demand more. Word of the new discovery spread through Shadewell, deepening the villagers' anxiety. Those who had stayed after Paul's sacrifice now faced a new, even darker fear. Had they only quieted the curse, leaving a deeper force waiting beneath the surface? The thought unsettled them, planting a seed of doubt that grew each day. Fiona and Ronan discussed their options. Restoring the spirals had appeased the curse temporarily, but Raphael's discovery hinted at a larger mystery. Could the binding mark be the reason for the curse's relentlessness? And if so, who had placed it there? The villagers, driven by fear, began to look to Raphael for guidance, hoping he could help them break the curse once and for all. But with each passing day, Ronan grew more suspicious, wondering if Raphael's arrival was more than mere coincidence. Late one night, as Fiona and Raphael sat together in the village square, Raphael shared a story from his past. I once knew a village like this, he said, his voice barely audible. They tried to break the curse, to free themselves, but they uncovered something that wasn't meant to be touched. Fiona leaned forward, sensing a deeper story behind his words. What happened to them? Raphael looked away, his face haunted. They tried to unbind the curse, but when they did, the darkness it held back was released. It destroyed everything in its path. His words lingered in the air, a silent warning. Shadewell had tried to appease the curse, But if the villagers attempted to break it completely, they risked unleashing an ancient force more terrifying than anything they had faced before. As dawn broke over Shadewell, Fiona realized they stood at a crossroads. They could either attempt to sever the curse once and for all, risking everything, or they could continue to appease it, bound forever to the shadows of their past. With each passing day, the village seemed to sink deeper into an ominous stillness, a lull before a storm. People moved quietly, their eyes cast down, afraid of what they might see if they looked too closely at the shadows. And as the rumors of the binding mark reached everyone's ears, the villagers turned to Fiona McCormick, Ronan Perez, and Rafael Garcia for answers. The remaining villagers gathered in the town square, the tension thick in the evening air. Fiona stood at the center, flanked by Ronan and Rafael, who had reluctantly become central figures in the struggle against the curse. The people of Shadewell looked to them, their faces etched with fear and desperation, hoping for a solution that could finally free them from the darkness that clung to their village. Fiona addressed the crowd, her voice calm but tinged with a hint of doubt. "We've done what we can to honor the pact and quiet the curse, but Raphael's discovery has revealed a deeper truth, a force bound by an ancient mark, hidden beneath Shadewell for centuries. If we leave it as it is, we risk that force growing stronger. But if we try to unbind it..." She trailed off, glancing at Raphael. Raphael's face was grave as he took over. Unbinding a curse is not simple. It's an act that requires intention, sacrifice, and an understanding of what you're releasing. The binding mark was created for a reason. Removing it could mean unleashing something that none of us are prepared to face. The crowd murmured in alarm, their anxiety only deepening. They had already given so much, had already lost loved ones to the curse. Yet here they were, faced with an even greater risk, unsure if they were prepared to pay the price that breaking the curse might demand. As the villagers debated, a rift began to form. Some, led by Raymond Lucas, one of Paul's remaining family members, argued that Shadewell had endured enough. He called for them to leave the curse bound, to accept whatever truce they had established with the forest spirits. "If we keep our distance, honor the pact, and leave the binding mark alone, perhaps we can live in peace," he insisted, his voice filled with conviction. Others, however, were driven by a fierce determination to end the curse once and for all, unwilling to live under its shadow. "How long until it demands another life?" argued Elise Morrison, a villager who had lost her husband to the forest. "This curse doesn't want peace, it wants control. If we don't break it now, it will continue to haunt us, generation after generation." Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael listened, realizing that they needed to come to a decision before the village tore itself apart. The fear and desperation had reached a boiling point, and any misstep could turn the villagers against each other. That night, unable to sleep, Fiona wandered into the forest alone, hoping to find clarity. She followed the spirals they had carved, each one seeming to pulse faintly in the moonlight. As she reached the clearing where they had previously performed the ritual, a strange sensation washed over her, a feeling of being watched, yet not by anything malevolent. It was as if the land itself was aware of her presence, waiting to see what she would do. In that moment, a vision appeared before her. She saw the village as it was centuries ago, untouched by fear or curses. Children played in the fields, families worked together, laughter echoed through the trees. But then, the vision darkened. She saw the original settlers carving away the forest, unearthing the burial grounds and disturbing the spirits that had long guarded the land. The vision shifted again, showing a dark figure standing in the clearing. It was cloaked, its face obscured, yet Fiona sensed a powerful, ancient sorrow emanating from it. The figure seemed to gaze at her, almost as if it could see her across time, and then it raised its hand, pointing to the binding mark on the ground. Fiona stumbled back, shaken by the vision's intensity. She understood now. The curse wasn't just about punishment or vengeance. It was a force born of grief, a desperate attempt by the ancient spirits to protect what they had lost. The binding mark was both a prison and a plea, a call for respect, remembrance, and ultimately, release. The next morning, Fiona shared her vision with Ronan and Raphael. She explained what she had seen, the sense of sorrow, the feeling that the curse was more than just a vengeful spirit. The curse isn't just a force of anger. It's a memory, A warning from the past, she said. If we can honor that memory, truly respect the spirits who once guarded this land, perhaps we can break the curse without unbinding the mark. Raphael listened intently, his face softening. I've heard of curses that respond to reverence, to acts of humility. If the curse truly is a call for remembrance, then we might be able to perform a ritual of release, rather than unbinding it completely. Ronan, though still skeptical, felt a faint spark of hope. A ritual of release. It would be a way to address the curse without risking what lies beneath. But it would require absolute sincerity and commitment from everyone in Shadewell. The three of them devised a plan. They would create a memorial within the forest, a place where the spirits could be honored, where the villagers could come to pay respects, and where the land could find peace. It would be a permanent marker, a sign that the people of Shadewell were willing to share their home with the spirits, to acknowledge the history of the land they lived on. They presented the idea to the villagers, explaining the vision and the need for respect, remembrance, and humility. At first, some were hesitant, unsure if a simple memorial could truly break the curse. But as Fiona spoke of her vision, of the sorrow she had felt, the villagers began to understand. They saw that the curse was as much a reflection of their own fears as it was an ancient power, and that the only way to break free was to approach it with reverence rather than defiance. Over the next few days, the villagers worked together to build the memorial. They used stones from the forest, each family contributing something personal, a token, an item of remembrance for those they had lost to the curse. They arranged the stones in a circle, with spirals carved into each one, creating a sacred space in the heart of the forest. Fiona led the villagers in a quiet ceremony, each person sharing a memory, a story, or a word of gratitude for the spirits. Ronan and Raphael joined her, guiding the villagers through a ritual of release, offering their respect to the spirits who had guarded the land for centuries. They spoke of peace, of unity, of a shared desire to live in harmony with the forest. As the ceremony concluded, a gentle breeze swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves and filling the air with a soft, ethereal warmth. The villagers stood in silence, feeling a sense of calm settle over them. It was as if the forest itself had accepted their offering, recognizing their sincerity. Then slowly the spirals carved into the stones began to glow faintly, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to breathe with life. The villagers watched in awe, realizing that they had finally found a way to communicate with the spirits, to honor the land in a way that might grant them peace. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnaturally so. The oppressive feeling that had haunted Shadewell lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. The villagers felt a new bond with the land, a sense that they were part of something much larger than themselves, a legacy of respect and reverence. Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael continued to tend to the memorial, ensuring that each generation of Shadewell understood its significance. They knew that the curse had been more than just a haunting. It had been a message, a reminder of the delicate balance between life, death, and the land they shared. Shadewell had entered a period of peace. The memorial to the spirits stood as a symbol of reverence, its quiet presence a reminder of the village's new pact with the forest. The oppressive atmosphere that had once hung over the village had lifted, and for the first time in recent memory, the villagers felt safe. They resumed their routines, grateful for the newfound sense of calm, yet always mindful of the ancient curse they had finally laid to rest. But Raymond Lucas, Paul's last surviving family member, couldn't shake a lingering sense of dread. He was proud of the villagers' resilience and their newfound connection to the land, yet he couldn't forget the sacrifice of his cousin, Paul, or the lives lost to the curse before the peace was found. It was as if something still tethered him to the tragedy, a darkness that refused to fade. And though he kept his fears to himself, a part of him worried that the curse wasn't entirely gone, that it lay dormant, waiting for a misstep. One night, as Raymond slept, he dreamed of the forest. In his dream, he stood at the edge of the memorial, the spirals on the stones glowing faintly in the moonlight. But as he approached, the glow faded, and a shadow fell over the clearing. In the darkness, he saw a figure, a faint, ethereal presence with familiar features. It was Paul, his face solemn, his eyes filled with sadness. In the dream, Paul reached out to him, his hand hovering over one of the stones. "The forest remembers," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the trees. "Don't let them forget." Raymond awoke with a start, his heart pounding. The words echoed in his mind, a haunting reminder of the legacy Paul had left behind. Unable to shake the feeling, he rose from his bed and made his way to the memorial, hoping to find clarity in the stillness of the night. As Raymond approached the memorial, he noticed something strange. The stones, once covered in clear, precise spirals, now seemed faint, their edges blurred as though worn down by time. The air felt heavy, thick, with an energy he couldn't explain. He reached out to touch one of the stones, feeling a chill run through him as his fingers traced the fading lines. He looked around, sensing a presence in the shadows, as though the spirits were watching him. But this time, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant, as though they were waiting for something he couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Raymond sought out Fiona McCormick and Ronan Perez, explaining his dream and the strange feeling he had experienced at the memorial. Fiona listened with a furrowed brow, troubled by his description of the fading spirals. She had thought the ritual of release had been enough, that the spirits had finally accepted their peace offering. But Raymond's experience suggested otherwise. "Maybe it's a warning," Fiona said quietly, her eyes distant. "Maybe the spirits are reminding us of the fragility of the pact, that it's not something we can take for granted." Ronan nodded, his expression serious. "Curses like this don't just vanish. They evolve, responding to the intentions of those who live on the land. If the village loses its respect for the pact, even slightly, the curse could awaken again." Raymond felt a chill as their words sank in. The memorial, he realized, wasn't just a symbol. It was a promise, one that would need to be renewed by each generation of Shadewell. If they failed to honor it, they risked everything they had fought to protect. Over the following weeks, Raymond noticed a subtle shift in the villagers. The initial awe they had felt for the memorial began to fade, replaced by the comfort of routine. People visited the site less frequently, and the stories of the curse were recounted as distant memories rather than active warnings. The fear that had once bound them together was gradually replaced by a sense of relief, and with it, a dangerous complacency. Raymond tried to remind the villagers of the pact, urging them to honor the spirits and respect the land, but his words often fell on deaf ears. The villagers were eager to move on, to leave the darkness behind them and embrace the peace they had worked so hard to achieve. Elise Morrison, who had lost her husband to the curse, voiced what many were thinking. "We've sacrificed enough," she said firmly. "The curse is gone, Raymond. We need to live our lives, not dwell on the past." Though he understood their desire to move forward, Raymond couldn't ignore the unease that grew with each passing day. He felt as though he were carrying the weight of Paul's warning alone, haunted by the memory of his cousin's sacrifice and the lingering fear that the curse wasn't truly gone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Raymond received word that one of the villagers, a young girl named Elsie Reynolds, had gone missing. She had been seen playing near the edge of the forest, but as night fell, she hadn't returned home. The villagers quickly organized a search party, combing through the forest with lanterns and calling her name. Raymond's heart pounded as he joined the search, his mind flashing back to the other disappearances, to the lives lost before they had established the pact. He prayed silently that this was just a simple case of a child wandering too far, that the curse hadn't returned. But hours later, they found her. Elsie lay near the edge of the clearing, her face pale, her eyes closed as though in sleep. The spirals on the stones behind her were faint, nearly invisible in the dim light, and a deep chill filled the air. Raymond's heart broke as he knelt beside her, feeling the familiar, oppressive weight of the curse settle over him. The curse, it seemed, had not been broken. It had only been sleeping, waiting for a moment of weakness. Devastated, Raymond and the villagers returned to Shadewell, the sense of peace they had enjoyed now shattered. Fiona and Ronan gathered the villagers the following day, urging them to honor the spirits and renew the pact. They reminded everyone of the legacy they had inherited, the promise they had made to the land, and the consequences of ignoring it. Raphael joined them, helping to lead a ceremony at the memorial. This time, the villagers approached the ritual with a new sense of humility. understanding that the curse was not something that could be banished with a single act. It was a presence, a force that demanded continuous respect. Each villager offered something to the memorial, a token, a small possession, a piece of themselves. They spoke of gratitude, of remembrance, of honoring those who had been lost. And as they performed the ritual, they felt the air lighten, the oppressive presence lifting once more. As the ritual ended, Raymond stepped forward, his heart heavy but resolute. He looked at the faces of his fellow villagers, each one a reminder of the lives they had fought to protect. He spoke of Paul, of the sacrifices that had been made, and of the responsibility they all shared to keep Shadewell safe. "This memorial isn't just a stone," he said, his voice strong and steady. "It's a promise. A promise to those who came before us, to those we lost, and to ourselves. We have to honor it. Every day, every generation. If we forget, we lose everything." The villagers listened, their faces solemn as they took in his words. They knew that the curse would always be a part of Shadewell, a silent presence woven into the fabric of their lives. But they also knew that with respect, vigilance, and unity, they could coexist with the spirits, honoring the past while building a future. As the sun rose over Shadewell, the villagers left the memorial, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They understood now that peace was not something that could be taken for granted. It was a fragile balance, one that required constant care and commitment. Raymond stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the villagers returned to their lives. He knew that his journey was far from over, that the weight of Shadewell's history would continue to rest on his shoulders. But as he looked out at the village, he felt a quiet strength, a determination to honor the legacy that Paul had left behind. In the days following the renewed ceremony, Shadewell seemed to find its footing once again. The villagers were more mindful, each one making it a point to visit the memorial frequently, leaving tokens or saying quiet prayers. But Raymond Lucas, haunted by the recent events and Paul's warning in his dream, remained unsettled. Though the curse had seemingly quieted, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper lay hidden, an answer they had yet to uncover. Driven by a sense of responsibility and a growing urgency, Raymond decided to investigate further, hoping to find any remaining clues that could shed light on Shadewell's past and the true nature of the curse. He approached Fiona McCormick and Ronan Perez, knowing they shared his need for answers. "Shadewell's curse may be more than a vengeful spirit or restless souls," he told them. "We've seen how it responds to us, how it feeds on fear and thrives on reverence. But I believe there's something beneath this, something we're missing." Fiona suggested they start with Shadewell's limited but precious archive. The dusty bookshelves and ancient documents held accounts from previous generations, stories and warnings passed down over centuries. They spent hours in the dimly lit village hall, sifting through faded records and yellowed pages, hoping to find any overlooked detail. At last, buried among the journals, Fiona discovered a peculiar document. A map of Shadewell, dated back several centuries. But what caught her eye was the marking on the map. An old symbol etched at the heart of the forest, far beyond where the villagers usually ventured. It was a twisted symbol, not unlike the spirals they had come to recognize, but more intricate, as if it held a deeper meaning. What if this is the true center of the curse? Fiona wondered aloud, tracing the symbol with her finger. We've only scratched the surface. There may be something, some force that's bound here, hidden in the depths of the forest. Raymond, Fiona, and Ronan gathered a small group of the bravest villagers, including Rafael Garcia, whose knowledge of ancient curses had proven invaluable. Together, they prepared to venture to the forest's depths, following the map's guidance to the symbol's location. Each carried a lantern, some provisions, and an offering for the spirits, hoping to make peace with whatever they might find. As they set off, the remaining villagers watched from the edge of Shadewell, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. Raymond felt the weight of their trust on his shoulders, knowing this journey could be Shadewell's final chance to understand and secure a lasting peace. The deeper they traveled into the forest, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Shadows seemed to move with them, thickening around the trees, and the air grew dense and cold. The forest was silent, as though it held its breath, waiting for them to reach the ancient symbol. The group followed the map closely, winding through dense thickets and uneven ground until they reached a small clearing, eerily quiet and undisturbed. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, cracked and covered with moss, its surface carved with spirals and symbols they recognized from the curse. It was clear this site had been abandoned for centuries, yet the carvings seemed almost fresh, as though the land had preserved this place in its memory. Raymond approached the altar, a chill running down his spine as he took in the intricate carvings. "This must be the heart," he whispered, "the true center of Shadewell's curse." As the group examined the altar, Raphael pointed out faint marks around its base, remnants of what appeared to be binding symbols, similar to the one they had found at the village's burial grounds. He explained that these marks were often used in ancient rituals to trap powerful spirits, keeping them bound to the land as guardians. "They weren't just protecting the forest," Raphael said, his voice low. "They were protecting something even older, something that lay dormant beneath this land. The spirits we've encountered, they're not the source of the curse. They're merely its keepers." Fiona's face grew pale as she realized the significance of the altar. If the spirits are guardians, then something else must lie beneath this place, something bound by their power. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had thought the curse was the result of a broken pact, a vengeful spirit haunting the land. But now, it seemed Shadewell's curse was a lock, one that had been keeping a far more dangerous force contained. As they deliberated over what to do, they sensed a presence in the clearing, a heaviness in the air, as though the very earth beneath them was watching. Raymond felt a tremor beneath his feet, a faint rumbling that seemed to echo from deep underground. Whatever lay beneath them, it was alive, and it was aware of their presence. They realized they faced a choice. They could leave the altar as it was, reinforcing the symbols and continuing the tradition of reverence, or they could attempt to release the binding, uncovering the true nature of what had been sealed beneath Shadewell. Ronan argued for caution. "We've done enough," he said firmly. "The spirits have kept this force contained for centuries. If we disturb it, we may unleash something none of us can control." But Raphael, ever curious, suggested that understanding the force might be the only way to end the curse for good. "If we truly want peace," he said, "we need to face whatever lies here, understand its purpose, and see if we can find a way to neutralize it." Raymond, torn between their perspectives, looked to Fiona. She understood his struggle, the weight of leadership that had been thrust upon him after Paul's death. Together, they decided to proceed cautiously, choosing to study the altar without disrupting it, hoping to find a middle ground that would respect the spirit's ancient purpose without endangering Shadewell. As Fiona and Raphael carefully examined the altar's symbols, they uncovered something chilling. Beneath the spirals and carvings lay a faint, almost imperceptible script, hidden under layers of ancient markings. The words were written in an old language, one that even Raphael struggled to understand, but he could make out fragments. "Bound to protect, a darkness that slumbers, a curse upon those who trespass." It became clear, Shadewell had not simply angered spirits with their broken pact. The village had been built upon a site of ancient power, a place where an entity or force lay dormant, bound by the spirits of the forest. By disturbing the land, the settlers had weakened the spirit's binding, allowing the curse to slip through and seek appeasement in the form of sacrifices. Ronan's face turned ashen as he realized the enormity of what they were dealing with. If the binding is weakened, then the curse will grow stronger, demanding more lives. "We can appease it for now, but it will return, each time hungrier than before." Knowing they couldn't fully release the binding without risking the village, the group decided to perform a ritual of reinforcement, hoping to strengthen the spirit's hold over the dormant force beneath Shadewell. They each placed an offering on the altar, symbols of respect and humility, as they recited words of reverence and peace. As they performed the ritual, the ground trembled, the air thickening with a dark, pulsing energy. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly, as though absorbing their offerings, and the forest around them seemed to come alive, the trees swaying gently as if in acknowledgement. Finally, the trembling ceased, and an overwhelming sense of calm settled over the clearing. The forest fell silent once more, and the oppressive presence they had felt, began to dissipate. As they made their way back to the village, Raymond felt a renewed sense of purpose. They hadn't broken the curse entirely, but they had reinforced the spirit's binding, honoring their role as protectors of the land. He knew now that Shadewell would always be bound to this ancient force, that their peace depended on a delicate balance of respect and reverence. The villagers welcomed them back with quiet relief, sensing that their journey had brought them closer to a lasting peace. And though they didn't share every detail of what they had encountered, Raymond, Fiona, and Ronan reminded the villagers of the importance of the pact, of the need to honor the land and its hidden history. As night fell, Raymond stood at the edge of the forest, gazing out over the village he had sworn to protect. The journey into the forest had left him humbled, his heart heavy with the knowledge of Shadewell's burden. Yet he felt a quiet pride in knowing they had done what was necessary, that they had found a way to respect the spirits while safeguarding their home. From that day forward, the villagers upheld the pact with renewed devotion, passing down the story of the altar, the spirits, and the force that lay hidden beneath Shadewell. They understood that true peace came from living in harmony with the land, honoring its ancient secrets, and remembering the sacrifices of those who had come before. For as long as the pact held, Shadewell would endure, a village bound by respect, humility, and a legacy of remembrance. Life in Shadewell settled into an uneasy peace, with the villagers dedicated to maintaining the pact and respecting the spirits that guarded the forest. Raymond Lucas, Fiona McCormick, and Ronan Perez frequently visited the forest altar, performing small acts of reverence, leaving offerings, and making sure the symbols remained intact. Yet despite their efforts, Raymond felt a persistent shadow over Shadewell, a sense that they had merely patched a fragile barrier holding something far more powerful at bay. One night, as the village lay shrouded in mist, a young boy named Rowan Peterson ventured too close to the forest edge. He was chasing his dog, who had slipped its leash and darted into the trees. As Rowan called for his pet, he sensed an unusual silence in the forest, an almost palpable stillness. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw it, a cloaked figure standing in the shadows, watching him from a distance. Rowan froze, fear gripping him as the figure raised a hand, motioning him forward. But in that moment, the dog barked, breaking the silence and startling the figure. It disappeared into the darkness, leaving Rowan shaken and breathless as he hurried back to the village, his mind racing with fear and confusion. Rowan's encounter caused a stir among the villagers. Many dismissed it as a child's imagination, a trick of the fog and shadows. But Raymond, Fiona, and Ronan knew better. They gathered with a few trusted villagers, including Rafael Garcia, and decided to investigate the area where Rowan had seen the figure, hoping to find any trace of the encounter. Armed with lanterns, they ventured into the forest, the mist swirling around them as they followed Rowan's description of the location. The forest was silent, an almost oppressive calm that seemed to hang in the air, intensifying with each step. Just as they reached a clearing near the altar, they saw it, a faint mark carved into the ground, a spiral similar to those on the stones but far more intricate, more deliberate. Fiona knelt beside it, tracing the lines with her fingers. "This wasn't left by us," she murmured. "It's almost as if someone or something wants us to follow." Ronan, peering into the darkness, felt a sense of foreboding. Perhaps the spirits are warning us, or maybe they're guiding us to something we've overlooked. As they stood in the clearing, a strange, rhythmic sound echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. It was a low, pulsing hum, as if coming from deep within the earth, vibrating beneath their feet. They exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the presence Rowan had seen was more than just a shadow. It was an echo of the curse itself, a force that had not yet been fully appeased. Following the sound, they ventured deeper into the forest, their lanterns casting eerie shadows that danced across the twisted trees. The sound led them to a narrow path that they hadn't seen before, overgrown with thick vines and brambles. At the end of the path lay a small stone structure, half buried and hidden from sight. It appeared to be an ancient shrine, long abandoned and reclaimed by the forest. Raymond felt a chill as he examined the shrine, his hand brushing over the faded symbols carved into the stone. This must have been a place of reverence, a site for rituals before the altar, he whispered. Maybe this is where the original pact was made, where the spirits bound the land's power. Fiona nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and trepidation. If this was the original site, then we're standing on the very foundation of the curse. Perhaps it was disturbed when the altar was built, creating the instability that allowed the curse to bleed into Shadewell. As they examined the shrine, the air grew colder, and an unnatural fog crept in, swirling around their feet. The rhythmic hum returned, louder and more insistent, vibrating through the ground and filling their chests with a sense of urgency. They sensed a presence, heavy and watchful, as though the forest itself had eyes, observing them from every shadow. Suddenly, the figure that Rowan had seen materialized before them, a cloaked, indistinct shape that seemed to blend with the mist, its face obscured. The group froze, feeling the weight of its gaze, an overwhelming sense of both sorrow and fury radiating from it. Raymond took a step forward, his heart pounding. "We mean no harm," he said, his voice steady but respectful. "We only wish to honor the pact, to understand what we can do to ensure peace for Shadewell." The figure remained silent, its presence heavy and unsettling, but it raised a hand and pointed toward the ground where they stood. The soil beneath them cracked slightly, revealing a glimmer of something buried deep below, a faint, dull light emanating from the earth. The figure's gesture seemed to communicate a choice. They could unearth what lay beneath, risking whatever darkness the spirits had kept sealed, or they could leave it undisturbed, bound to continue the cycle of appeasement and reverence indefinitely. Raphael, filled with curiosity, argued for unearthing it. "This could be our chance to understand the curse completely," he urged. "If we know what lies beneath, we can confront it, perhaps even break the curse entirely." Fiona, however, sensed a deeper danger. "Some things are meant to remain hidden," she countered. "We've seen that disturbing this land has only led to more suffering. If we release what lies here, we may doom Shadewell forever." Raymond looked at the figure, hoping for guidance, but it only stood in silence, its form gradually fading as though dissolving into the mist. He knew they had reached a crossroads, a decision that would define Shadewell's future. After a tense discussion, they agreed to respect the spirit's warning and leave whatever lay buried undisturbed. They understood that Shadewell's curse wasn't something that could be solved or broken. It was a presence that required reverence, a force tied to the land's history and memory. They performed a final ritual at the shrine, each of them leaving an offering and speaking words of respect and gratitude for the protection the spirits had provided. As they finished, they covered the exposed ground, burying the faint light once more, hoping that this act of reverence would be enough to maintain the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Returning to Shadewell, the group shared their experience with the villagers, explaining the need to remain vigilant and honor the pact. Raymond reminded them that the curse, though quieted, would never truly be gone. It was a force that required balance and respect, a bond between the living and the spirits who guarded the land. Many villagers were troubled by the news, realizing that the peace they enjoyed was delicate, a fragile truce that could be broken if they neglected the pact. But they accepted their responsibility, pledging to uphold the traditions and honor the spirits as their ancestors had done. Over the following weeks, the village maintained a heightened awareness of the pact, frequently visiting the memorial and shrine, leaving offerings and sharing stories of the curse with younger generations. Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael continued to guide the villagers, ensuring that the memory of their journey and the sacrifice of those lost would be preserved. Raymond, though still haunted by Paul's warning, felt a sense of relief. He understood that Shadewell's peace was not something they could take for granted, but rather a responsibility that would require their constant dedication and respect. The encounter with the cloaked figure had solidified this understanding, a reminder that some mysteries were meant to remain hidden, respected rather than conquered. In the wake of the encounter with the cloaked figure, Shadewell returned to a delicate balance. The villagers continued their reverence at the shrine and memorial, each visit a reminder of the responsibility they bore. Yet the sense of peace was tinged with an underlying tension, a feeling that something was waiting just beneath the surface. Couldn't shake the memory of the faint light they had seen beneath the forest floor. and Fiona McCormick sensed that the spirits were still watching, as if anticipating a moment of reckoning. One evening, Fiona was sorting through old village records when she stumbled upon a document she had never seen before. It was a letter, yellowed with age and addressed to an ancestor of Paul Lucas, a warning left by someone who had witnessed the first stirrings of the curse. The words were hurried and urgent, as though written in a moment of desperation. The letter read, "Beware the land's memory, for it is unforgiving. To disturb what lies beneath is to risk awakening an ancient power. Respect it, and it will guard you. Challenge it, and it will consume all that you hold dear." Fiona's heart raced as she read the final line, a chilling reminder that the land held a memory longer and deeper than any of them could comprehend. She knew this was more than just history. It was a warning that their ancestors had lived and died by. Fiona shared the letter with Raymond, Ronan, and Rafael Garcia, and together, they pieced together the events that had led to Shadewell's curse. It became clear that the settlers had initially disturbed the burial grounds and carved new paths through the forest, weakening the spirit's ability to guard the land. The ancient force beneath the forest had responded, feeding on the settlers' fear, growing stronger with each disruption. "Shadewell's curse isn't just about vengeance or spirits," Raphael said, his voice solemn. "It's a living memory, a response from the land itself, bound to protect what lies beneath." Ronan's face grew tense. "If we ignore this warning, if we fail to remember, we risk undoing everything we've worked for. The peace we have now depends on respecting that balance." Raymond felt the weight of the responsibility that had been handed down through generations. He saw Shadewell's history through a new lens, understanding that the curse was not just a supernatural force, but a call to honor the past. They were custodians, bound by an ancient pact that demanded respect and vigilance. Realizing the importance of this legacy, Raymond gathered the villagers once more. In the village square, he shared the contents of the letter, the warning from the past that could no longer be ignored. His voice was steady as he addressed them, his words carrying the weight of Shadewell's history. "Our ancestors left us this warning because they understood the price of disturbing the land," he said, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "We are the guardians of this place, and if we forget that, if we fail to honor this pact, we risk unleashing a force we cannot contain." The villagers listened, their faces solemn as they took in the gravity of his words. They understood now that Shadewell's peace was not something they could simply enjoy. It was a privilege, one that required them to live in harmony with the land and respect its memory. Determined to strengthen the villagers' commitment, Raymond proposed a new tradition, a ritual of remembrance that would be held each year, honoring those lost to the curse and reaffirming their dedication to the pact. The villagers agreed, eager to create a legacy that would protect Shadewell for generations to come. The ritual would include offerings to the spirits, tales of those who had sacrificed for the village, and a renewal of the symbols on the stones and at the shrine. Each family was to contribute, ensuring that the ritual was both a collective responsibility and a personal commitment. On the night of the first ritual, the villagers gathered at the memorial, each one carrying a token of reverence. They placed these tokens around the shrine, creating a circle of offerings that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Fiona led them in a quiet chant, her voice steady and clear as she spoke words of peace and gratitude. As the ritual concluded, Raymond felt a strange sensation, as if a veil had lifted, allowing him to glimpse something beyond the physical realm. In his mind, he saw the forest in its untouched state, alive with the spirits that guarded its ancient secrets. He saw the original settlers, their faces filled with wonder and fear, carving paths through the forest and building homes, unaware of the force they were disturbing. Then he saw Paul. His cousin's face was calm, filled with a quiet pride, as he looked upon the villagers, each one honoring the land and its legacy. It was as if Paul's spirit had been watching, guiding them, ensuring that they understood the importance of what they had achieved. The vision faded, leaving Raymond with a profound sense of peace. He knew that Paul's sacrifice had not been in vain, that his cousin's spirit had found solace in knowing Shadewell was finally on a path of respect and remembrance. The next day, the villagers decided to inscribe the contents of the letter onto a stone tablet, placing it at the center of the memorial. It would serve as a reminder to future generations of the pact they had made, a physical symbol of the village's commitment to honoring the land. They placed the tablet near the shrine, carving the warning from the letter into its surface. To challenge what lies beneath is to invite destruction. Respect the land, and it will protect you. Forget, and it will consume all. Ronan added a final touch, engraving the names of those who had sacrificed for Shadewell, including Paul and the others lost to the curse. It was a tribute, a lasting acknowledgement of the legacy they had inherited and the price that had been paid for their peace. With the ritual and the inscription in place, the villagers felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew that their commitment to the land was more than a duty. It was a bond that united them, a shared responsibility to protect Shadewell and the secrets it held. The curse had become a part of their identity, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of the delicate balance between the past and present. Raymond, Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael continued to guide the villagers, each one ensuring that the legacy of respect and reverence would not be forgotten. They understood that the curse would always be present, a silent guardian that watched over them, but they also knew that with their commitment, they could maintain the peace. On the anniversary of Paul's passing, Raymond visited the shrine alone, his heart filled with gratitude and respect. He placed a small token, a carved wooden spiral, at the base of the tablet, a symbol of his promise to honor the pact. As he knelt in the quiet of the forest, he felt a presence beside him, a faint warmth that seemed to radiate from the earth. He knew it was Paul, watching over him, a silent guardian who would forever remain bound to Shadewell. The forest, though shadowed and ancient, felt alive with a quiet energy, a peace that was neither complete nor permanent, but balanced. Raymond rose, his heart steady, knowing that Shadewell's future was secure, protected by the strength of its people and the memory of those who had come before. A year had passed since Shadewell established the ritual of remembrance, and the village had experienced a peace unlike any before. With each season, the villagers honored the land through quiet offerings, tales of those lost, and a renewed respect for the ancient spirits that watched over them. But as the anniversary of the first ritual approached, Raymond Lucas proposed a new idea. A village-wide festival that would mark the passage of time, binding the living and the spirits together in celebration. The villagers embraced the idea eagerly, seeing it as a way to celebrate their survival and acknowledge the bond they had forged with the land. They decided to call it the Festival of Shadows, honoring both the light and dark aspects of Shadewell's history. The festival would include a procession to the shrine, feasting, storytelling, and a ritual that would serve as both an offering and a promise to uphold the pact. As preparations began, there was a sense of excitement in Shadewell, tempered by the solemn awareness that the festival was also a tribute to the lives lost and the sacrifices made. The villagers gathered to decorate Shadewell in preparation for the festival. They hung lanterns along the paths, each one symbolizing a life lost to the curse. The lanterns cast a warm, flickering glow that illuminated the village, transforming the familiar streets into a place of reverence and beauty. Shadows danced across the stone houses, reminding everyone of the delicate balance they had worked to preserve. In the center of the village square, they erected a large spiral made of stones, a symbol of the pact they had forged with the spirits. Each villager placed a small token within the spiral, a flower, a trinket, a piece of cloth, creating a mosaic of offerings that represented their gratitude and respect for the land. Raymond, Fiona McCormick, Ronan Perez, and Rafael Garcia led the preparations, each one contributing their knowledge and dedication to ensure the festival reflected the spirit of Shadewell's unique history. They hoped the Festival of Shadows would be a way for future generations to understand the importance of the pact and the legacy of those who had come before. As dusk fell, the villagers gathered in a quiet procession, carrying their lanterns and walking toward the forest shrine. The procession was silent, their footsteps a steady rhythm as they followed the winding path through the trees. Each villager held their lantern high, lighting the way through the shadows, their faces solemn but filled with quiet pride. When they reached the shrine, they formed a circle around it. placing their lanterns on the ground to create a ring of light around the ancient stones. Fiona led them in a chant, a soft melodic hum that resonated through the forest, filling the air with a sense of peace and reverence. The villagers offered their tokens, each one a gesture of respect and humility, as they acknowledged the spirit's presence. As the chant faded, Raymond stepped forward, addressing the spirits. "We honor you, guardians of this land, and we thank you for the peace we have found. We pledge to remember, to respect, and to uphold the pact we have made." Following the procession, the villagers returned to the village square, where they gathered in a large circle around a bonfire. It was time for the storytelling, a tradition meant to preserve Shadewell's history and pass down the tale of the curse, the pact, and the spirits who guarded their land. One by one, villagers shared stories of their ancestors, of the courage and resilience that had sustained Shadewell through its darkest times. Fiona told of Paul Lucas, whose sacrifices had paved the way for the pact, and whose memory remained a guiding force. Raphael shared tales of his travels to other cursed lands, recounting how each village had its own unique bond with the supernatural, but none as profound as Shadewell's. Ronan spoke of the cloaked figure, the ancient force that had watched over them from the shadows, and reminded the villagers of the delicate balance they had achieved. "The curse is both a guardian and a warning," he said solemnly. "It's a reminder that we are guests on this land, bound to honor those who came before and those who protect it still." As the night deepened, the villagers performed a traditional dance around the bonfire, their movements casting long, twisting shadows across the ground. The dance was meant to honor the spirits, each step a symbol of respect and unity with the land. The flickering light of the bonfire illuminated their faces, casting both light and darkness, a reminder of the balance they had come to accept. The dance grew in intensity, each movement reflecting the villagers' connection to the forest and the spirits who dwelled there. The children joined in, their laughter mingling with the crackling of the fire, and for a moment, Shadewell felt as though it was suspended between worlds, a place where the living and the spirits could coexist in peace. As the festival neared its end, Raymond approached the memorial with a final offering. He held a small vial of water, collected from the river that flowed through Shadewell, symbolizing life, memory, and the continuity of their commitment. He poured the water over the stones, watching as it trickled down the spiral, soaking into the earth and uniting with the land. With a voice filled with respect, he spoke to the spirits. "We honor our promise and ask for your blessing. May the memory of Shadewell's history and the sacrifices made here live on through us and those who come after." The villagers stood in silence, their hearts heavy with gratitude as they acknowledged the spirit's role in their lives. They felt a calm settle over them, a sense of closure as though the land itself had accepted their offering, recognizing their dedication to the pact. Just as the festival concluded and the villagers began to disperse, a faint light appeared in the distance, hovering at the edge of the forest. It was small, almost like a wisp, but it grew brighter, illuminating the trees in a soft, otherworldly glow. The villagers watched in awe, sensing that the light was a sign, a quiet acknowledgement from the spirits, a token of their acceptance and peace. The light lingered for a few moments, casting a gentle glow over the village before it faded, disappearing back into the depths of the forest. Fiona, standing beside Raymond, felt a tear slip down her cheek as she watched the light vanish. She knew that this was a rare gift, a sign that the spirits had accepted their presence, if only for a moment, and that Shadewell's peace was secure as long as they honored the pact. With the success of the first Festival of Shadows, the villagers agreed to make it an annual tradition, a celebration of Shadewell's unique history and the bond they had forged with the spirits. The festival would serve as a reminder to future generations of the sacrifices made, the legacy of reverence, and the delicate balance they must uphold. Raymond, Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael continued to lead the village, each of them committed to preserving the memory of the curse, the pact, and the spirits who guarded the land. They understood that Shadewell's peace was a gift, one that could be broken if they neglected their responsibilities. Late that night, after the villagers had returned to their homes, Raymond walked to the edge of the forest, the quiet shadows stretching out before him. He looked into the darkness, his heart filled with respect for the spirits who watched over Shadewell, and for the villagers who had embraced their role as guardians. In the distance, he thought he saw a faint figure, a cloaked shape, standing silently among the trees, watching him with an unreadable expression. He didn't feel fear, only a quiet understanding, as though the figure was acknowledging his dedication to the pact. Raymond nodded, a gesture of respect, before turning back to the village, leaving the figure in the shadows. He knew that Shadewell would be safe, its people united by the memory of those who had come before, bound by a pact that would endure as long as they honored it. The years passed peacefully in Shadewell. Each season, the villagers held their rituals, honoring the spirits, visiting the memorial, and celebrating the Festival of Shadows. With every passing year, the memories of the curse and the sacrifices made grew into legends, stories told to children as a reminder of the delicate balance between life and the land. Yet as time passed, a subtle change began to settle over the village. Raymond Lucas noticed it first, a strange silence in the forest, an absence of birdsong, and the usual rustling of animals. The air around Shadewell felt heavier, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Raymond, who had become the quiet steward of Shadewell's legacy, couldn't ignore the growing unease that lingered at the edges of the village. One evening, he gathered Fiona McCormick, Ronan Perez, and Rafael Garcia, sharing his concerns. "The forest? It feels different, almost withdrawn," he said, his voice tinged with worry. "It's as if the spirits have drawn back, like something is keeping them at bay." Fiona frowned, sensing the truth in his words. "Perhaps the land is reacting to us," she murmured. "It's been years since the curse was first appeased. Maybe we've become too complacent, assuming that the spirits would remain satisfied." As they spoke, an elderly villager named Esme Reynolds, one of Shadewell's last connections to its earliest settlers, approached them. She had been a child when the first deaths from the curse were whispered about, and her life had been spent in the shadow of Shadewell's history. Her eyes, though clouded by age, held a knowing glint. "I felt it too," she said, her voice steady but grave. "The land has grown quiet, but not in peace. It's waiting for something that we may not see coming." Raymond felt a chill at her words, understanding that Shadewell's past was closer to the surface than they realized. "Do you think the spirits are warning us, that the pact we've upheld may not be enough?" Esme nodded slowly. "The spirits are bound to the land, but they're not immune to time. Perhaps it's not enough to remember, we may need to find a way to truly seal the bond." Determined to understand the forest's silence, Raymond, Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael decided to journey to the ancient shrine once more. They carried offerings, lanterns, and the ritual tokens they had used in past ceremonies, hoping to renew their connection with the spirits and to find some clue as to what had caused the forest's withdrawal. The path was darker than they remembered, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches thick and twisted. The stillness was profound, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps. As they reached the shrine, they noticed that the spirals on the stones had faded, the carvings nearly invisible, as though they had been worn down by time. Raphael placed his hand on one of the stones, feeling its cold, lifeless surface. "It's as if the connection we established has weakened," he said quietly. "If the spirits are no longer here, it could mean that the pact itself is at risk of breaking." Fiona took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then we must do something to renew it. To remind the spirits that we honor their presence and their role as guardians of the land." As they prepared to begin their ritual, Raymond noticed something unusual beneath a layer of moss near the shrine. He brushed it aside, revealing a hidden trapdoor, its surface marked with ancient symbols similar to those on the shrine's stones. The villagers had never known about this entrance, and its presence sent a shiver down his spine. With some effort, they pried the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase that descended into the earth. The air within was stale, heavy with the scent of age and stone. They exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this hidden chamber held secrets that had been long forgotten. Together, they descended into the darkness, their lanterns casting eerie shadows across the walls. The staircase led to a small room carved into the bedrock, its walls lined with symbols and spirals, even more intricate than those on the shrine above. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, upon which lay a single ancient scroll. Ronan stepped forward, carefully unrolling the scroll. Its writing was faded but still legible, an account written by one of Shadewell's earliest settlers. The scroll revealed a truth that stunned them, a ritual more binding than any they had performed, a ceremony that would merge the spirit's presence with Shadewell, creating an eternal pact that would safeguard the land and its people for generations. The scroll described a ritual called the Eternal Pact, one that would require an offering from the villagers that went beyond material tokens. It demanded a commitment of spirit, a joining of the living and the ancient forces that protected the land. In exchange, the spirits would remain bound to the forest, ensuring that the land would be safe from any harm, but also placing a responsibility on each generation to uphold the bond. As they read the details, Raymond felt a weight settle on his heart. He realized that Shadewell's peace had always been temporary, a truce that would only last as long as they maintained the spirit's presence. The Eternal Pact offered a solution, but it required a deeper sacrifice, a promise that the village would be bound to the land, its people committed to honoring the spirits indefinitely. Returning to the village, they explained the discovery to the villagers, sharing the gravity of the ritual and what it would demand from each of them. The villagers listened, some with fear, others with resolve, understanding that this was the only way to secure Shadewell's peace for future generations. The villagers agreed to proceed with the Eternal Pact, each one contributing a personal item that represented their connection to the village and the land. They would gather at the shrine at dusk, performing the ritual in the silence of the forest, sealing their bond with the spirits in a final act of reverence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers assembled, each carrying their offering, a ring, a tool, a trinket passed down from ancestors, as a token of their devotion. Raymond, Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael led them in a solemn procession to the shrine, each one feeling the weight of the moment. At the shrine, Raymond read the words of the Eternal Pact from the scroll, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke of Shadewell's history, the sacrifices made, and the legacy they would leave behind. As each villager placed their offering on the shrine, they repeated a pledge to honor the spirits, to protect the land, and to remember the pact for as long as they lived. Fiona and Raphael led the final prayer, a chant that resonated through the trees, filling the forest with a powerful energy. As the ritual reached its peak, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, stirring the leaves and causing the lanterns to flicker. The air grew warm, as though the spirits had accepted their offering, acknowledging their commitment. Then, from the depths of the forest, a faint light appeared, a figure cloaked in shadows, watching them with a solemn gaze. The villagers held their breath, recognizing the presence as the spirit that had guided them through their trials. The figure raised its hand, a silent gesture of blessing, before it faded into the darkness, leaving behind a sense of calm and fulfillment. With the Eternal Pact sealed, the villagers felt a profound sense of peace, as though they had become one with the land itself. The forest, once silent and withdrawn, came alive again. Birds returned, their songs filling the air, and the usual sounds of wildlife resumed, bringing Shadewell back to life. Raymond, feeling the weight of their accomplishment, knew that they had secured Shadewell's future. The Eternal Pact was not just a ritual, it was a bond that would endure, a promise that would bind them to the land in a way no curse could break. Each generation would carry the knowledge and responsibility of the pact, preserving Shadewell's legacy and ensuring that the spirits remained forever intertwined with the village. The villagers returned to their lives, but they did so with a renewed understanding of their place in Shadewell. The Eternal Pact became a central part of their identity, a reminder of the balance they had achieved with the spirits and the sacrifices made to protect their home. Raymond, Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael continued to lead the village, each one committed to ensuring the pact's legacy was upheld. They knew that Shadewell's peace was not a gift, but a duty, a bond that would endure as long as they respected the land and the spirits who watched over them. Years later, as the village grew and new generations were born, the Eternal Pact remained a constant presence, a silent guardian that watched over Shadewell. The shrine and memorial became places of reverence, where villagers came to pay respects, to honor those who had come before, and to renew their commitment to the land. Decades had passed since the villagers of Shadewell first performed the eternal pact. The land, once marred by fear and darkness, had become a place of peace, woven with memories and respect for the spirits who watched over it. Shadewell had grown, its population flourishing under the quiet protection of the pact. The villagers lived in harmony with the forest, honoring their bond through rituals, festivals, and quiet acts of reverence. Raymond Lucas had aged, his hair now white, his steps slower, but his heart still tied to the village and its legacy. He had become a revered figure in Shadewell, known as the guardian of the pact, a man who had dedicated his life to preserving the balance between the land and the people. One evening, feeling the weight of years and responsibility, he called for a gathering in the village square, eager to share the history of Shadewell's bond with the younger generation. The villagers assembled in the square, young and old alike, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of lanterns. Raymond stood before them, his voice steady as he began recounting the story of Shadewell's curse, the pact with the spirits, and the journey that had led them to peace. He spoke of Paul, Fiona, Ronan, and Raphael, of the sacrifices made and the wisdom they had gained from the spirits. The eternal pact is more than a promise, he told them. It is a commitment that each of us carries, a bond that binds us to this land and to those who came before us. To live in Shadewell is to remember, to honor, and to protect. As Raymond spoke, the younger villagers listened with awe, feeling the weight of the legacy they had inherited. Many had grown up hearing fragments of the story, but hearing it from Raymond, the man who had lived through each trial, made the pact feel alive, woven into the very fabric of Shadewell. At the end of his story, Raymond invited the villagers to place their hands upon the memorial stone in the village square, a physical act to renew their commitment to the pact. As each person touched the stone, they felt a connection to the land and to the spirits, a quiet acknowledgement that they were part of something far greater than themselves. Fiona, now an elder herself, stepped forward, leading a chant of remembrance. Her voice, though aged, was strong and filled with reverence, carrying the weight of the past and the hope of the future. The chant was picked up by the villagers, their voices filling the square, uniting them in a moment of shared respect and gratitude. As they finished, the forest seemed to respond, the wind whispering through the trees, the shadows softening as if acknowledging their commitment. The villagers felt a presence settle over them, a silent blessing from the spirits, a quiet assurance that the pact was still strong. In the weeks that followed, Raymond sensed his time was coming to an end. He had lived a life dedicated to Shadewell, and he was content, knowing that the village would endure. On a cool autumn evening, he made one final journey to the shrine deep within the forest, carrying a small carved spiral, a token of his life's dedication to the pact. He placed the spiral on the shrine, bowing his head as he offered a quiet prayer. May Shadewell always honor the spirits, and may this land remain a place of peace. As he stood, he felt a warmth settle over him, a comforting presence that felt like an embrace, as though the spirits themselves were welcoming him. Raymond returned to the village one last time, spending his final days surrounded by friends, family, and the people he had protected. When he passed, the entire village mourned, his life celebrated as a legacy of respect, courage, and unwavering dedication. In honor of Raymond, the villagers held the largest festival of shadows they had ever seen. The festival was a tribute to his life, his dedication, and his role in maintaining the pact. Fiona led the ceremony, sharing stories of Raymond's leadership and recounting the history of Shadewell for all to hear. She reminded them of the pact's significance, urging each villager to carry it forward with the same reverence Raymond had shown. The younger generation stepped forward, eager to uphold the legacy. They promised to preserve the balance, to honor the spirits, and to keep Shadewell's unique bond alive. Each child placed a small token at the shrine, creating a mosaic of offerings that would remain as a symbol of their dedication. Ronan, now one of the village elders, watched with pride, knowing that the future of Shadewell was in capable hands. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that the pact would endure, that Raymond's legacy would be carried forward by those who understood the land's history and the price of Shadewell's peace. As the years continued, the eternal pact remained the cornerstone of Shadewell's identity. The village thrived, its people living in harmony with the land, the spirits, and each other. New generations learned of the pact from their elders, understanding that their peace was a shared responsibility, a commitment that transcended time. The shrine and memorial became sacred sites, visited by villagers seeking guidance, comfort, or simply a moment of reflection. Shadewell became known as a place of quiet strength, a village bound not just by its history, but by its respect for the unseen forces that guarded the land. The spirits continued to watch over Shadewell, their presence felt in the gentle breeze, the rustling of leaves, and the quiet stillness that settled over the village each night. And though they remained hidden, the villagers sensed that they were never truly alone, that the land, the spirits, and the legacy of those who had come before were forever intertwined. One evening, a young girl named Eliza, curious and wide-eyed, wandered to the edge of the forest. She had heard the stories of the spirits and the pact, but wanted to see the shrine for herself. As she stood there, looking into the depths of the forest, she thought she saw a faint light, a soft, gentle glow moving between the trees, watching her with a presence that felt both ancient and kind. She raised her hand in silent respect, as her elders had taught her, and the light flickered, as if acknowledging her. Eliza felt a warmth settle over her, a quiet assurance that the spirits were still there, bound to Shadewell by a promise that would never be broken. With a smile, she turned back toward the village, her heart filled with pride and a sense of belonging. She knew that she was part of something timeless, a legacy built on respect, unity, and an eternal bond that would guide Shadewell for as long as the village remained. As she walked home, the forest remained peaceful, its shadows watching over her, bound forever by the eternal pact and the lives of those who honored it.